Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to start talking about some of the critical aspects of Iago's execution of his plan to diminish and destroy Othello in Act 3. First, I'd like to discuss a little bit of the concluding segment of Act 2, and then we'll go over a recap of what has happened in the story just thus far so that we can all situate ourselves, understand what has transpired up until this point, and get a stable groundwork and footing for what's going to come. This act is going to focus on the relationship between Desdemona and Othello and the way in which it is evolving or devolving based on Iago's influence and subversion. We're going to take a look at Othello's internal conflict and his underlying fears. In other words, what we see coming to the fore that was concealed previously by his veneer of confidence. And we're going to look at the way in which, as Iago puts it, the more is changing with his poisons, the way in which Iago has actually begun to affect Othello's capacity for critical thought negatively. So, concluding our conversation on Act 2, in Act 2, Scene 3, lines 335 to 345, Iago offers us some startling self-revelations wherein Shakespeare establishes the true nature of devilry as it is conceived in this work. Elizabethan notions and prior notions of devilry would have connected it with blackness. And Brabantio draws on these cultural concerns regarding the association between devilry, the demonic, and witchcraft, and also the exotic and the foreign, as with Moors, when he accuses Othello of using magic or a potion to enrapture Desdemona. Iago, at the culmination of Act 2, reveals his nature as the true devil of this piece, as Shakespeare begins to invert the color signifiers of white and black, good and evil, angelic and demonic. Iago, in line 330, identifies Othello's true weakness, that his love for Desdemona is such that he will give her any license, or license to do whatever she pleases. Then Iago refers to the divinity of hell. He suggests that he can call upon the powers of hell itself, deception instantiated and embodied, in order to effect his will on others. Now, he doesn't mean this literally because he tells Rodrigo that he works by wit, he works by intelligence and cunning, a keen perception of human nature and the best ways to manipulate it, rather than witchcraft. But Shakespeare is connecting him with this idea of devilry or magic. When devils wear their blackest sins put on, they do suggest at first with heavenly shows, as I do now. So the greatest of the devils, Satan himself, as the Bible tells us, appears as an angel of light. Iago seeks to destroy other characters' most noble elements. He seeks to attenuate and diminish their nobility. So he says, I'll pour this pestilence into his ear. It's as if I'll fill up his head through my speech by speaking into his ear. My very language is going to be a poison to him that will corrupt his thoughts and kill him. I'll convince him that she repeals him for her body's lusts. In other words, that she is having an affair with Cassio. And by how much she strives to do him good, so will I turn her virtue into pitch, and out of her own goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all. So I will take their very goodness and use that as the tool to destroy them. Othello is of a free and open and noble nature. That's his weakness. I can turn his goodness and his nobility against him to destroy him, because he believes that other people are trustworthy just as he is. And Desdemona is so compassionate and so kind that I can use that to convince Othello that she is unfaithful to him. There's a special kind of villain who can take the virtue, the moral character and caliber of his enemies and use it as the net to entrap them and to destroy them. Iago is that devil that professes to be an angel of light. Now, in terms of what we've seen in the play thus far, basic overall summary for those of you who have asked me about it. Iago has been passed over for a promotion by Othello. We've seen that in Act 1. Othello, the general of Venice, has instead chosen a man by the name of Michael Cassio to serve as his lieutenant. Iago, along with Rodrigo, plots revenge against Othello because Rodrigo is in love with Desdemona, and Othello has married her. So Iago comes with a plan that he says will help Rodrigo to possess Desdemona sexually and destroy Othello to their mutual benefit. Iago, Desdemona, Othello, and Michael Cassio, Othello's lieutenant, all head to Cyprus in order to defend it against a Turkish armada that is sailing for the island state. Iago is continually hunting for a new motive. He's constantly searching for some way to validate or to justify the tremendous hatred that he demonstrates towards Othello. In Act 2, Iago encourages Cassio to get drunk, and Cassio begins a brawl with both Rodrigo, whom Iago sends out to insult him, and with Montano, another one of the soldiers on the island of Cyprus. Because of this, and because their actions as officers under his command have imperiled Othello's public standing, Othello casts Cassio out and strips him of his position. Iago then counsels Cassio with the best kind of advice, as he says, "Who's to say that I'm a villain when the advice that I give is so true?" He says to Cassio, "Go and speak to Desdemona. She has Othello's ear, and she's so kind and so piteous, she can help you, and she will be inclined to help you." Iago hopes to convince Othello that Cassio is having an affair with Desdemona. And scene 3, or I should say Act 3, scene 3, is a protracted poisoning of Othello by Iago. At the end of Act 3, Iago's wife, Emilia, picks up a handkerchief that belongs to Desdemona. This handkerchief was a gift that Othello gave to Desdemona, and he received it from his own mother. His mother told him to give this handkerchief to the woman that he believed he would marry and be in love with for the rest of his life. So he treats this as a kind of symbol of the devotion that he has to Desdemona, and the way that she responds to it and treasures it is representative of her views on the marriage. Now, Emilia picks up the handkerchief off the ground after it is lost in a kind of argument between Desdemona and Othello. She then gives it to Iago, and Iago reveals that he has desired this handkerchief, or he's asked her about it several times. Iago plans to plant this handkerchief inside Cassio's room in order to convince Othello that Desdemona has given it to Cassio as a sign of her affection for him. Now, we are introduced eventually to Bianca. Iago's plan is to use Bianca, a young woman whom Cassio has used sexually and promised to marry, but has no intention of doing so. He is going to convince Othello that as Cassio and Iago are speaking about Bianca, they are in fact speaking about Desdemona. So when he hears how Cassio has used this unnamed woman for his own pleasure and how he doesn't care about her at all, Othello, listening in the darkness, listening off stage to this conversation he can only half make out, thinks that they're talking about Desdemona, and so has confirmation, or what he believes to be confirmation, of the affair between Cassio and Desdemona. At the end of Act 3, Iago and Othello enter into a pact whereby they agree to murder both Cassio and Desdemona if it's proven to them, or if it's proven to Othello, that Desdemona has truly been unfaithful. Now, in Act 3, Scene 3, Cassio approaches Desdemona to try to convince her to help him to regain his lieutenantship, to bring him back into right relationship with Othello. Cassio speaks to Desdemona, and Desdemona seems to believe that she has the right, the authority to promise him his position again. So she usurps a kind of position that she lacks in the public sphere, largely because Othello has given her license to do so. He put his life into her hands in the trial scene. And so, if you want to use a colloquialism, she's grown too big for her britches. She promises things that she doesn't have the right to offer, because she's now flush with a series of victories over her father, the rescue of Othello, the defeat of Iago in this battle of wits in Act 2. And then she says in line 20, "I give thee warrant of thy place, Cassio. I give you assurance that your place will be restored." She doesn't have the right to do so, but she does so nonetheless. So we see her beginning to move beyond not just the limitations that are imposed upon her gender in this era that Shakespeare seems to celebrate when she speaks out against her father and the way in which he attempts to control her, but beyond the standards of propriety and decorum, beyond the standards of a private individual. She usurps the position of a public general by assuring Cassio that she is going to restore him to his position. And in so doing, she seems to denigrate Othello. She does exactly what Iago was doing earlier on in the play, reducing Othello to the status of an animal. So in Act 3, Scene 3, line 23, she says, "I'll watch him tame and talk him out of patience. His bed shall seem a school, his board a shrift. I'll intermingle everything he does with Cassio's suit. I'll watch him tame." You tame an animal. Her successes and the allowances that Othello has given her have made her somewhat arrogant. Iago has essentially infected her with a sense of superiority over Othello. And she too picks up that association between blackness and animality that was so condemnable in Brabantio. Now, Iago, observing this, coming in with Othello, suggests some kind of hint of impropriety. He's constantly offering these offhand comments that turn Othello's mind and cause him to begin seeing something amiss in the relationship between Cassio and Desdemona. But it's the relationship between Othello and Desdemona to which I'd like to turn now. So I have two discussion questions for you to consider as you begin to break down Act 3, Scene 3, line 40 to 103. Pause the video, think about these two questions, come back, and I'll give you some answers to them that I have developed. As I see it, their relationship is contentious and fraught with difficulties. It seems almost as if they're in love with the idealized vision of their partner's character than they are with the actual individual. Because the moment they enter into contact with each other and to begin to engage with each other, their relationship starts to fall apart, and we see these cracks appearing that we didn't recognize earlier on. She again feels like she has the power and the right to speak her mind. She badgers Othello continually, even to the point that Othello agrees to embrace Cassio and return Cassio to his position because, as he says, I will deny thee nothing. Now, one of the reasons that Othello begins to grow so angry in this exchange is that Iago has already primed him to respond in a certain fashion. He's introduced the notion that there's something untoward about the relationship between Cassio and Desdemona by saying, oh, I like that not, when he sees Cassio leaving. Othello, in turn, begins to pick up on the same hints because he's been conditioned to pick them up by Iago. Desdemona says in line 53, he hath left part of his grief with me to suffer with him. Good love, call him back. So she's saying, I'm suffering with Cassio. I felt with him. Remember the reason that Othello fell in love with Desdemona. Right? She loved me for the trials that I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. So their entire relationship was predicated on Othello telling her the story of the woes of his life, telling her the story of his life and winning her to him, and her ability to empathize with, sympathize with his experience. Here, he's hearing the exact same thing relative to her relationship with Cassio. Now, Desdemona is not content. She's not content to receive victory or to simply achieve victory. She has to have Othello thank her for what she's done. She says, after Othello says, I will deny thee nothing, why, this is not a boon. 'Tis as though I should entreat you to wear your gloves or feed on nourishing dishes. In other words, I'm doing something for your own good by restoring Cassio to his position. I'm not asking for something for myself. I'm helping you. I should get thanked for it. Desdemona doesn't know when to let things lie. She is so puffed up. She's so pleased with her own previous successes that she has lost some degree of the sympathy that defined her earlier on in this play. Also, her vision of Othello and his reasonability has been attenuated. So, Othello, if Desdemona had just let it go there, would have had no more reason to suspect that something was awry. So that's another reason that Othello reacts with such anger. Desdemona keeps on pressing him. It's not enough to get what she wants. He has to thank her for it. And lastly, look at what Desdemona has to say about Michael Cassio. Michael Cassio helped you when you were trying to woo me, when you were trying to court me for marriage. So in line 70, she says, what, Michael Cassio that came a-wooing with you? And so many times when I have spoken of you dispraisingly, hath taken your part, to have so much to do to bring him in? In other words, Cassio helped you to woo me. How could you do this to him? How could you deny him his place? I mean, think about it. All the times I spoke to him about you dispraisingly, all the times I complained to him about what you were doing, and he's taken your part and defended you. And Othello just starts thinking about this. You've been talking about me with him behind my back, saying negative things about me. Oh, okay. So embedded in this exchange are a number of different provocations that set Othello's mind at ill ease. He's beginning to suspect that there's something amiss between Desdemona and Cassio because Desdemona is overly forceful, and there are all these hints or suggestions that when taken the wrong way, or when viewed in the incorrect light that Iago has cast on them, begin to call into question Desdemona's virtue and her, well, fidelity to Othello. The next video is going to continue our analysis of Act 3 from this point.